In the last 4 classes, we walked together with the first philosophers in history who lived in what today would be called Turkey, in 2 cities, especially Miletus and Ephesus. We walked with Thales, who thought that the first principle of everything was water, and with Anaximander, who thought that it was what he called apeiron, the without borders or limit, and with Anaximenes, who thought that the first principle was air, and with Heraclitus, who thought that the first principle was fire or becoming. We didn't really pay that much attention on their specific responses, which from several respects might appear silly to us. Water, air, fire especially, they're so far from our contemporary understanding of science that it doesn't really make sense to think of those elements as the principles of everything in nature. But we tried, especially with the help of Aristotle, to understand the rational path that these philosophers were walking, and especially in trying to make sense of the existence of things as moving, as changing into everything else. They had this strong insight about nature being made of things that are turning, constantly moving to something else, into everything else really. And they tried to make sense of it, trying to understand what the logical principles and requirements would be of this movement. And from this angle, they can still teach us a lot. And they are doing that. They figure that somehow, in order to make change and movement possible, there is a need for a material cause or principle, something that remains the same beneath and before the change. So for a statue, for a stone to become a statue, we still need the same material. So the matter has to be there in point A and in point B. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any movement or change. And this principle has to be indeterminate, indefinite, without definition, without border, we would say with Anaximander, compared to both points. Because you can call point A stone and point B a statue, but you cannot call both points the same way. So what is moving, staying there beneath the change, has to be not each of them. So they figure that there is some kind of indetermination which has to be there if for things to exist as they are. But then they also figure that this principle needs some kind of determination. So it has to be somehow both things. So when we understand things, we name them, we call them, we close them into these borders. So this that Aristotle would call the formal cause or principle was already in their very first insight, because the need for indetermination came from the determination of things in nature. And then, especially with Anaximenes, they thought that they realized that they also need some kind of power, energy, a dynamism in nature to make things move. They also needed an efficient cause, which for Anaximenes was intrinsic in air. Air for him was already moving by itself. So, and we might say that water too was kind of moving for Thales, but air was clearly indicated as a sort of intrinsic power, efficient power to move and cause everything else. Also, Anaximenes tried to explain the difference, condensation and rarefaction in the air as the reason why things appear different, despite the fact that they are all made of the same, out of the same thing, which would be air for him. So overall, they thought that they saw the need for two kind of co-principles. One was a principle of indetermination, and one was a principle of determination. In focusing on movement, Heraclitus took the argument to an extreme, saying that what really exists is movement, in the sense of what things are not. So the truth of everything is that they are not, is what they are not, because movement is a change from being to being not, from being here to not being here, and not being here, I'm going there, but my movement is always about not being here. If I try to stop it, that is not anymore a movement, so it's not anymore the real thing. So if I try to stop the movement, it's not anymore real. So the real thing is not being. We cannot go twice into the same water. This is one of his most famous fragments. So now let's just move to Italy. All these first philosophers were in Turkey, the first big Greek colony. And but then some of them, especially a famous thinker called Pythagoras, he was born there apparently, so in a city called Samo, but then he decided to move to a better place, and so he went to the south of Italy, of course. Who would question that, right? And there he created his own school in a city called Crotone. And this school was more than philosophical school, was an ascetical school, a religious school. We don't really have any way to distinguish between Pythagoras and the other scholars or students in his school. Even Aristotle would just call them the so-called Pythagoreans. And they were famous especially for inventing, discovering the mathematical thought. And they thought that the first principle, following up with the kind of reasoning from their colleagues in Turkey, they thought that the first principle of everything was numbers. So now let's try to figure it out. I mean, how can they say that the first principle is numbers? Even this statement, as you know, air, water, fire, might look silly somehow to our contemporary mind. Even though in the case of numbers is one of the most fascinating insight even for contemporary scientists today are fascinated. They have always been fascinated with the idea of numbers being kind of real. I talked recently with some friends of mine who are very good scientists, and they usually tell me, Fulvio, when you get really so deep in the equations and the way in which mathematics works, you kind of start seeing numbers. They're real. I mean, you see them in nature, you see them out there, which is pretty much what happened with the Pythagoreans. Think about it. I mean, Aristotle gives us some clues about how they came to think of numbers as the first principle. Aristotle writes in the first book of the Metaphysics that they saw that the attributes of the musical scales were expressible in numbers, and all other things seemed to be modeled after numbers. Think about it. Let's say that you are observing the movement of some planets, and you find out that this movement is subject to some kind of mathematical law that explains it. It tells you exactly how that's happening. It's kind of not only obvious but correct from some viewpoints to say that these numbers are kind of real because they are causing this movement of the planets. They are the reason why it's happening, and it's what's behind it, and also what makes it understandable to us. So numbers is really what things we observe, what movements we observe are made of somehow. They are the principles of their being that way, they're moving that way, because being a movement is exactly what we observe in things. And they notice that music is, which is a harmony. We listen to music as a harmony, as the order of things somehow. And music can be expressed in a numeric way. Now, when you see this thing, the nature this way, it acquires a different color, the color of an intelligibility, which is a deeper truth of things. Things are not chaotic, they answer to some kind of intelligent reason, path, design, and this is what they truly are, what truly makes them be what they are and makes them move as they move. So in a sense, they of course, I mean, we are talking about a very long time ago, so it's kind of easy for them also to mix this insight with several mythological ideas of the world. So numbers would become some kind of also divine elements. They might become objects as such, things that to us would be more, less interesting. But the idea that there is a principle intrinsic to things that make them act and move and exist as they are and do, this is something that still keeps some truth and some interesting aspect. Pythagoreans were not neglecting all the previous understanding of reality by the philosophers from Ephesus and Miletus. In fact, they knew that somehow for things to be what they are in movement, they needed to keep some kind of indetermination and determination. For them, numbers were an expression of these principles. So, in a sense, numbers were not the very first, as we count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., are not the very first principle. They are kind of composed by something else. And they called these co-principles the unlimited and the limited, sometimes also called the infinite and the finite, which to us at this point should be kind of obvious too, right? Because we know that somehow movement in nature requires some kind of indetermination and determination. And I already mentioned in past classes why they thought that odd numbers would indicate a limitation, a determination in things, and also a perfection from that viewpoint. And even number would indicate a lack of determination, an infinity, and an imperfection too, because perfection would go with the borders, with something that help us define what things are, that makes us somehow stop the process of becoming and say what actually they are. And this was because they were written down with stones, and if you put the stones, in a sense, everything in between, in the middle, is open and goes to the infinite. While if you put a third stone or a fifth stone, right, you have the two lines, and then you put the one in the middle. It closes the circle. It closes the definition. It puts a limit, a border. So that would be both finite, determinate, and also a definition and the perfection of things. So this is why they thought of the even and uneven number, and amazingly enough, this coincides with some kind of Aristotelian distinction between material cause and formal cause, because the material cause would be the one that by definition doesn't have any border, any definition, and the formal is what by nature possesses a definition and the perfection of things. Even though some authors claim that to read Pythagoreans through the distinction of Aristotelian distinction between matter and form would be a kind of historical mistake, because they didn't really have that distinction in mind. Still, as far as philosophical insights are concerned, both distinctions and the history of the previous philosophers are pointing to these two principles that explain movement. One principle which is not determinate and somehow can be there behind any change of movement, and one principle which is perfectly determinate and help us define and say what things are. So they would say that the numbers, the odd numbers, somehow are prevailing in the limited, and the other ones, they even are prevailing on the unlimited. Or another way of saying that is the odd number are almost a kind of jetting out of the determinate element. So they are kind of trespassing, and the other ones, the even, are jetting out of the indeterminate element. There are several aspects of the Pythagorean school, especially their religious attitudes, their ideas of the soul and of the divine, which are not really part of my concern in this path we are walking through, because I'm more interested in following a rational discussion about the way in which movement and things have been understood in reality, and how these insights can help us even today in developing a sound understanding of things around us. And from this viewpoint, an amazing development that we took from, in the history of thought, that we took from the Pythagorean school, is the idea of a cosmos. They saw the world as cosmos. They were the first philosophers who used this word to describe the entire universe. And this is what is so fascinating about it. They even saw, in a sense, the highest skies, the heavens, as moving according to some music, in producing music by moving. They thought we couldn't hear it, or that we were so accustomed to this music that we don't hear it anymore. But it's there because the heavens and the whole world moving produces some music. Because the music is the incarnation of harmony in things. It's also, as fire was for Heraclitus the way to visualize becoming, to visualize an insight, as air for Anaximenes was a way to visualize the apeiron, the unlimited, the indeterminate principle of everything. At this point, for the Pythagoreans, music is a way to visualize the mathematical formulas floating around. They produce a harmony and you can hear it. So music somehow is the expression of the harmony. But harmony is order, is intelligibility. So once you start studying the world according to his intelligibility in mathematical way, the world becomes a different world. It becomes transparent to reason. Somehow it embodies reason in itself. So from the chaos of the first poet in Greek culture, chaos is what is behind everything. It's the father of all gods. From everything, chaos is at the very beginning of things. Now we have the order. We have the cosmos as a picture of everything. So everything became orderly, and for that very reason, intelligible. This idea that things are intrinsically intelligible is a key for science, is a key for our understanding of reality, because this is what we do all the time. When we understand something, describe it, and then go back to the world and do something with the world, what we are doing is treating the world as something that does have an explanation, does answer to some laws that we can both understand at first and then use back to mold the world the way we want. But that means that the world is intelligible and is somehow a unity, not just a bunch of different things. There is a unity beneath the kind of chaos of different realities. So the world sometimes might appear at first a bunch of different things, but when you look into it better, you find some laws that give unity, an intelligible unity to things. So cosmos is a way to unite everything into an intelligible scheme. And this is what we owe to the Pythagoreans most, from the viewpoint of our vision of the world as a new discovery in Greek philosophy. Thank you.